In the Byzantine Empire, they used smoke signals to relay messages back from the frontier to Constantinople, the capital. And they had a whole system set up, which was they had towers built and they would have pyres on the top that they would light. And if there was a threat on the frontier, the first one closer to the frontier would be lit.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's in the Lord of the Rings film, right?
Okay, exactly. It's exactly that.
Andrew, did you see recently that Andy Jassy, who's the CEO of Amazon, sent a note to all Amazon employees demanding they will come back to the office?
Yeah, I did, and it just made me kind of go, how would I react to that if that was what happened to me at the university where we work quite fluidly, quite hybrid, and I also have quite a long commute, so it wouldn't be the most palatable thing to me.
As it turns out, to a lot of Amazon employees. So today, in today's episode, we really want to talk about, we don't want to talk about Amazon, we want to talk about virtual teams, but it's obviously really timely, especially with the background of that message from Andy Jassy. And I think one of the things that would be really fun to do today is actually really talk about what is a virtual team, what is a remote team, what is a hybrid team, what are we talking about? And actually, I think we can go into some of the historical precedents that were set that, because humans have actually been remote for quite a long time in ways that we might not think about. But let me go back to the Jassy part, to Andy Jassy's message. So this got a lot of pushback. Andy Jassy sent this message out, and there was an immediate and very strong reaction from a lot of people inside Amazon. But what I would like to do is I want to read some of his message. I'm going to go through it quite quickly. I've cherry picked it, but some of the communication here is really interesting as well. So thinking about teams and communication, I found it really interesting to read the message, and I think it's important to sort of understand the context of what he was saying, because he didn't just say come back and work in the office. There was more context to it than that. So from, and I'm shortening this, but from Jassy's message, it says, our culture is unique and has been one of the most critical parts of our success in our first 29 years. But keeping your culture strong is not a birthright. You have to work at it all the time. When you consider the breadth of our business, their associated growth rates, the innovation required across each of them, and the number of people we've hired the last 6 to 8 years to pursue these endeavors, it's pretty unusual and will stretch even the strongest of cultures. Strengthening our culture remains a top priority for the S team and me. And it's maybe important just to say the S team is Amazon's senior leadership team.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that.
He goes on to say, we want to operate like the world's largest startup. That means having a passion for constantly inventing for customers, strong urgency. For most big opportunities, it's a race. High ownership, fast decision-making, scrappiness and frugality, deeply connected collaboration. You need to be joined at the hip with your teammates when inventing and solving hard problems, and a shared commitment to each other. And then he finishes, or he doesn't finish, but at the end of the bit that we want to go through are two areas that the S team and I have been thinking about the last several months are: one, do we have the right org structure to drive the level of ownership and speed we desire? And two, are we set up to invent, collaborate, and be connected enough to each other and our culture to deliver the absolute best for our customers and the business that we can? We think we can be better on both. We've decided we're going to return to being in the office the way we were before the onset of COVID. When we look back over the last 5 years, we continue to believe that the advantages of being together in the office are significant. I've previously explained these benefits, but in summary, we've observed that it's easier for our teammates to learn, model, practice, and strengthen our culture, collaborating, brainstorming, and inventing a simpler and more effective. Teaching and learning from one another are more seamless, and teams tend to be better connected to one another. And that's it. That's
A lot to unpack there.
There is a lot to unpack, but I think as a piece of executive communication, it's pretty good. It could probably be a little bit more bottom line up front. It sort of leads into its point a little bit too much for my liking, but he sets out a stall that very particularly innovation and invention is difficult remotely. It's more difficult than it is being co-present. And then he says, everyone is coming back to the office. And as far as I can tell, I don't have any insight into this, but from what is publicly available, this was sent to all employees.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of points that stuck out to me, which are slightly contextual, but the first question I had was, a company the size of Amazon, does returning to the office mean that all teams, as they're defined in the business, are now co-present? Because I presume there must be some team functions that are happening across locations. So I don't want to call it a gimmick, but that's the word that comes to my mind. Like the gimmick of, we're all going back to the office so that we're all going to be together physically all the time. Is that a slight myth in terms of actually how the organization operates? And the second was, is that literally how they operated before COVID? Or was there more fluidity before COVID, and actually COVID has narrowed the focus on these things that never really presented themselves as worthy of attention before?
There's a few clues in the message. One is that he says in the message that if you were co-located before, if you're in the office, you will be going back. The offices that had fixed desks will continue to have fixed desks. So there is that idea that you will be assigned a desk and you go and work from that desk, which seems really quaint now. I can't actually even imagine that, because I've spent so long working with flexible hot desking inside offices, even when you are co-present, that I almost can't imagine having a fixed desk anymore. But he says that the offices that previously had fixed desks will go back to having fixed desks. And there were elements, he acknowledges there were elements of fluidity before, if you needed to work from home because you had caregiving tasks that you needed to take care of, then you would be allowed to do that just in the same way that you were before. But the expectation, the normality, is that you're in the office. And there is also a mention that even being in the office 2 or 3 days a week, because that's really the change. It's going back to 5 days a week. Even being in the office 2 or 3 days a week, you can miss each other. And he's very specifically focusing this on the performance of invention. And I think there is a whole wider thing there about, I get that. I get that invention and innovation is difficult when you are not physically present, or more difficult when you're not physically present. But there have to be an enormous number of people in Amazon. He does say, we're an unusual organization. They're enormous. They have grown faster than most organizations. They are unusual.
They're the world's largest startup.
Which is what they want to maintain. The growth rates are huge. The invention that they do is really significant. But what he's saying is, we want to come back to invent. There's a whole load of operational roles that the invention part of that falls to the wayside a little bit. And one of the things, when I was researching it for this episode, one of the things that I found, which I've shared with you as well, and we'll put in the show notes for this, is there's also a paper that was co-authored by Michael Arena, Glenn Carroll, Charles O'Reilly, John Golden, Scott Hines. And that is a collaboration between researchers at Stanford University, University of Pennsylvania, and Amazon Web Services. So two researchers from Amazon themselves. And this paper was really interesting. So you can tell the paper was from 2022. So perhaps it informed, Andy Jassy mentioned that he had previously talked in February 2023 about the benefits of co-location. So maybe it informed that. I would be surprised if it didn't. And those researchers were from AWS. Andy Jassy used to be the CEO of Amazon Web Services. Now Andy is the CEO of the whole of Amazon, but I would be surprised if there wasn't something cutting through that. And in that paper, it's a really interesting paper, and it is very well researched, and it cites some great examples from Microsoft as well. There is a quote directly from the Adaptive Hybrid Innovation with Virtual Work paper. It says, to mitigate these concerns about innovating in a virtual environment, we propose the adaptive hybrid work model. This method helps leaders to recognize a company or team's specific stage of innovation, ideation, incubation, or scaling, and then directs employees to work in person or virtually according to the requirements of that stage. What's really interesting in that research is this Stanford and AWS research paper looks at where it is appropriate to be co-located and where it is appropriate or reasonable to be remote. And what Andy Jassy has done in his missive to the entire Amazon staff is actually break from that research paper. Has said, no, now everybody needs to be co-located all the time, and there's obviously some reason behind that. There's the research in this AWS and Stanford paper, and then there is Amazon coming all the way back to the office, which I think is a really good jumping off point for us to then look at, well, okay, he is clearly saying that co-present teams are more effective than hybrid or fully remote teams. But there are companies that make virtual teams work. And also, virtual teams have been around for a long time. So I think probably now it's maybe a good time for us to actually try to define exactly what a virtual team is.
The thing that's important for us to do is give a definition and then slowly step away from it and not treat it with in too strict a form, because I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done in virtual teams. Interestingly, I think we consider it to be a phenomenon that has gripped us post-pandemic, but people have been researching this for decades, actually. And it's certainly, I'd say, the early 90s, as the capacity of the internet was starting to demonstrate itself, people were kind of saying, well, there's a revolution. We're never going to have to go into the office again. We can, it was almost one of these classic kind of utopia situations of, oh, this new technology is going to unleash something that we never before thought was possible. So it was all very upside. And then as it's been actually used and virtual teams have started to proliferate, actual data has been collected and we've started to understand the nuance of it. Definitionally, what we're talking about is two very clear-cut things that define a virtual team. And that is that members of the team, not necessarily all of them, but certainly key component members of the team are separated by some kind of distance. And I guess what we'd say there is they're physically separated. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are in a different country or in a different continent or time zone, but they where they do their work from predominantly is not co-located, as I would say. So that's the first feature. And by virtue of the fact that they are not co-located, the second feature is that they rely on some kind of communication technology to do their work together.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah,
because I think you're spot on. Those are definitely two of what I would see as the three things that makes it a virtual team. The first, which we shouldn't overlook, is it's a team rather than a group or a committee or a political party.
right. Yeah, of course.
So to be a virtual team, first you have to be a team, and you have to sort of labor under all of the things that makes you a team in the first place. Because I think it's easy to look at remote communication. I was thinking about when we were preparing for this, I was thinking about sort of military leadership has been diverse and global, fully remote and empowered by communication for years, but that doesn't make it a team. And so very specifically to constrain what we're talking about, it is first and foremost a team, and then geographically diverse, or as you quite rightly say, dispersed enough that communication by technology is, or non-present communication is required, and then that communication is probably facilitated by some sort of technology.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Remembering that there's a lot of technology mediated communication that happens in organizations that isn't necessarily facilitating teamwork.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I'd say those three will define it for us, and you'll find all kinds of definitions in different significant pieces of research on virtual teams. A little note to say, you also hear them referred to as distributed teams, and in the Andrew Jassy stuff, we've also heard about this concept of hybrid teams. I say that we remain relatively relaxed about where the boundaries are between the definitions of those things. The distributed team concept was probably an ancestor of what we nowadays call a virtual team.
Yeah.
Um, and you've also hybrid teams is, if it's not intuitive enough already, a hybrid team is a team that is sometimes co-located and sometimes operating virtually, and that sits in a Venn diagram of what the new normal is, which is, a lot of organizations have maybe fixed days in the working week where everyone has to be in the office, or by virtue of different people's flexible working arrangements, they all overlap on certain days, and that renders the team a kind of hybrid team. But I would say what we're going to talk about, whether you are a kind of thoroughbred virtual team, born virtual, and you're operating in, you work from an office in your house, and all of the people you connect with are scattered all over the world, and you only really pursue your work together virtually, or whether you exist in one of these kind of new normal situations where flexible work means that you do a lot of your work virtually, what we're going to talk about still applies. So we can be relatively relaxed about the definition.
Probably the nicest thing that I saw when we were looking at this to come up with a good definition was the description of it being a scale. It is not virtual or not virtual. It is a scale from fully present, co-located, working synchronously all the time, to let's say, for example, having to communicate with astronauts when they're in space. So to potentially lead onto some of your topics, exactly as you say, it is a scale from very, very traditional formats of work that can only be done in person, to adding levels of remoteness to that, to fully remote teams that have potentially never met in person but still function like teams.
So say if you're achieving a substantive amount of your work assisted by technology, and regularly your ability to work in kind of co-presence is limited, then you're probably kind of admissible as a virtual team. But as I say, the elements of and the kind of characteristics of what working in a virtual team are like still apply, even if it's basically, my team all works in the same office, but we're not actually all there all the time, and that requires us therefore to use technology. So let's remain a bit fluid about it. It's also, I think, important to acknowledge this is not some kind of newfangled way of working that has emerged since we were all in lockdown during COVID. If you go back to that core characteristics, distributed geographically, or at least physically distributed, and relying on some form of technology to achieve communication. Well, in the Byzantine Empire, they used smoke signals to relay messages back from the frontier to Constantinople, the capital. And they had a whole system set up, which was they had these sort of towers built, and they would have fire pyres on the top that they would light. And if there was a threat on the frontier, the first one closer to the frontier would be lit.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's in the Lord of the Rings film, right?
Okay. Exactly. It's exactly that. So, we're talking about the 9th century there. So that was an early form of virtual team interaction. And then fast forward to the 20th century, an early example of trying to effectively organize around virtuality was the kind of space race period in the 1960s.
One of the things that does really stand out is, I know you used the example of the signal fires, and we had semaphore across ships. Those early examples were really not virtual teams. They certainly came before virtual team communication, but I think, as you say, it took probably until the middle of the 20th century for communication technology to have evolved to a point where it could actually be used in teamwork rather than in something which was communications sort of between organizations, between relatively separate entities.
Yeah, right. And I think even when we were talking about the definitions there, one of the reasons it's flexible is because the definition, as you see it in the literature, has perhaps become more specific over time as improvements in technology have unlocked our ability to actually achieve work, effective teamwork more readily. And yeah, and there's if you look back into deep distant history, that evolution is evident in how advanced technology was, because the Apollo missions in particular, the extent to which they relied on technology and really experimented with pushing the boundaries on all these fronts, it's a leading example of and therefore an early example of using uh, communication technology to achieve teamwork. But it's a classic virtual team, because you have three guys in a tin can up to 250,000 miles away, heading towards the moon, and you've got a whole set of teams at mission control communicating with them, and they're relying on technology to do so. And that was the quintessential origin story, I would say, of contemporary virtual teamwork. Um, and I think some of the stuff that I like about, because it's all very well it's all very well documented, but you also saw early examples of some of the difficulties that virtual teams experience. I love the story of Apollo 7. We all know about Apollo 11, moon landings, Neil Armstrong, blah blah blah. Um, the Apollo numbers lower than 11 were all staging posts to getting on the moon, right? They were all rehearsals for different stages in the process of achieving a moon landing. So Apollo 7 was one of those. And I love the story of Wally Schirra, who's the commander of Apollo 7. And basically, they fell out with mission control. And there's a lot more nuance to the story than that, but it boils down to like Wally Schirra, commander of Apollo 7, threw his toys out the pram about stuff. But I'm summarizing here, I'm skipping over details, and I'm probably sailing close to the wind of slightly misrepresenting some of it, but just for the sake of brevity. But basically, the the history with him was, because you'll know that at the Apollo 1 mission, um, there's this famous fire that happened, and it killed all three astronauts that were due to man the Apollo 1 mission. So that Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White, who all died, and that kind of, it traumatized the whole Apollo setup. And you had all these other astronauts who knew they were going to go up, and so Wally Schirra, who he was a veteran of both Mercury and Gemini, so he was actually like the Apollo missions. He's a naval test pilot. He was in Mercury, Gemini, highly decorated, original NASA astronaut, and this was the end of his career. And I think perhaps that had a part to play in it, but basically he was paranoid as a result of concerns over safety and suspicion as to whether things have been resolved. Apollo 7 was his last mission. Like, he was retiring after Apollo 7, and he got a cold. Like, a day into the mission, he got a cold. But apparently getting a cold is really unpleasant when it's in zero gravity, because gravity is not helping anything.
Yeah, I don't even want to
leave your body. Yeah, so it's pretty miserable. It's horrible. High pressure in the head, and so he's very grumpy. But long story short, they got paranoid about mission control not telling them stuff, and he was really concerned about the integrity of the spacecraft. And there's lots of anecdotes from the transcripts in Apollo of him being kind of short and sharp, a bit snippy, let's say, with mission control. And it all came to a head with him being like, "We're not wearing our helmets for re-entry." So when they're coming back to Earth, he's like, "We're not wearing our helmets." And it kind of was because of his cold, because he didn't want to put an extra thing that was really tight around his head on his already overpressurized head. So he was like, I'm mission commander. None of us are wearing our helmets. The mission controller like, well, you kind of should wear your helmet because it's dangerous re-entry and, it's highly volatile and predictable. Blah, blah. He's like, no, we're not wearing it. But, the what was underpinning all this was like an erosion of trust in the
Yeah,
other part of the team that he was
yeah,
separated from. And this is one of the things, we'll come back to talk about some of these things, I'm sure, shortly. But what some of the difficulties virtual teams have is, especially when you've got, which is commonly the case, you've got a virtual team where some members are co-located in one area and other members are co-located in another area. And the implicit trust that develops between those who are co-located and on the other side of the coin erodes the trust that they have for the team that's elsewhere, or the part of the team that's elsewhere. And this was a classic example, breeding suspicion and paranoia about the intentions of the others. And it happened in Apollo 13 as well. You'll maybe have seen the film, the Apollo 13, the successful failure as they called it. But the astronauts on Apollo 13, they did the same thing when they felt like mission control were trying to micromanage them through the crisis. They removed all of their health sensors because the flight surgeon was annoying them. Well documented, and they actually even make a reference to it in the film. That was the same thing. They were growing suspicious of, because you got to remember, so they're a virtual team, three of them separated, long distance, coming back to Earth. They didn't know if perhaps mission control had realized there was no way they were going to get back, and they were basically just kind of giving them palliative care. They were telling them things just to
yeah.
soften the blow of their inevitable death. And there was a bit of a mutiny, and they ripped off all of their sensors. They're like, well, fine, you're not going to be able to tell anything about us anymore because we're annoyed at you.
Yeah, the trust thing is so important, and that was one of the reasons that I really wanted to say earlier. It has to be a team first, because trust is an implicit part of being inside a team. And as you've said before, and I now quote regularly, trust is earned in drips and lost in buckets. And what I found fascinating is some of the best teams research that I found was from the late 90s and early 2000s. It is not, and very similarly to a lot of the other teams research that we've done, there is some really fantastic and still completely relevant material that comes from 20 years ago. There was a piece of work, I think it's by Yarvenpar and colleagues, and it's called "Is Anybody Out There? The Antecedents of Trust in Global Teams." They first talk about what trust is. Broadly, it is an expectation that others will act in a certain way, and that because you have a shared understanding of what the common goals are, they will act in your interest in a certain situation. But they also talk about how in a traditional face-to-face context, trust takes time to evolve. Cummings and Bromley suggest that collective trust has an effective cognitive and behavioral intent component. It was found that cognitively based trust factors are a precursor to the development of effectively based trust, and that it is broadly, so in this research, it is broadly much more difficult to establish trust when you are in this remote situation in a virtual team than if you're co-located. There are so many things when we're co-located that help build trust, and I'm sure that many people that are listening to this that have worked in hybrid or remote teams where they are using email or video calls to talk to colleagues. It takes a lot longer to build trust in a remote setting than it does when you're co-located, because all of those tiny cues that you get, whether it is somebody offering to make you a cup of tea. We've talked before about the power of somebody offering a cup of tea to their team. But that expectation of behavior is a small signal. It's one of those small drips that builds trust, builds expectation. Because I don't think trust is always, this person is going to act in my interest. It's sometimes trust is just, I know how this person will react in this situation. I can trust them to act in a certain way. Sometimes that's sufficient.
You're talking about kind of rational trust and relational trust, and so we can logic it out that Mark does what he says he does, what he says he's going to do, and I've got enough evidence to say that I can trust Mark to do things. That's very different to how I feel about Mark and his behaviors and how I trust him. And these are things that are developed in different ways. But Yeah, it's I think there's another feature that is talked about a lot in the literature about virtual team interaction, which is uh, the task versus relationship dynamic. And that's, the trust thing is influencing that dynamic as well, which is uh, virtual team interaction tends to be very dominated by task related content or
Yeah.
task related activity, task related discussion. It's a little bit more challenging to develop relational interaction virtually. And because there's a focus on task, affective trust can become underdeveloped as a result of that. It's one of the things that is evident in research on virtual teams is we kind of have to do a bit of the suspension of belief around about expectations of normal interaction. I think it's really easy to think of, right, so, we are recording this virtually. It's easy to assume, therefore, all of the normal rules about interaction, communication, discourse apply, and we're just doing it through a computer. Actually, that's not the case. There are things that we need to be aware of, and then we need to manage for them in order to mitigate for their negative impacts. So all of the stuff that is really focused on at the kind of top level issues to do with virtual teams are to do with these relational features. So difficulty in building social cohesion, issues with trust. There's also a concept around depersonalization and dehumanization, which also has these flavors of the humanity, the affect, the relationship features of the way in which we work together. So it comes back to, there are things that we get from being physically together that are tacit, salient, and unconscious, and they form a kind of interactional foundation that allows us to proceed with the way in which we communicate with each other in a way that feels natural and normal and secure and safe. And virtual interaction removes some of our capacity to achieve those things. These are kind of social psychology, anthropological concepts, but things like co-presence, co-regulation, another thing called biobehavioral synchrony. And all of these things are just like what happens to us when we are in the same room as each other doing stuff, and not to do with teamwork necessarily, but it's just the way in which we actually co-regulate together because we're in the same place. If I'm doing like an away day, which I do for organizations and stuff, one of my favorite things to do at the very start of the day is to get everyone to breathe together. And I like do controlled breathing. Okay, right, everyone, breathe in, hold, breathe out. Um, and it's a little bit of a gimmick because I'm like, okay, we've all just done a breathing exercise, so it's been good for us. But our bodies tune in to each other and recognize that there's actually a calming and a sense of increased security when our bodies realize that they're in sync with other bodies. That's all denied to you when you're working virtually. Um, and it then leads to things like dysregulation of discourse and interaction. So it can become disinhibiting. So I just might be a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more threatening
Yeah.
or say a bit too much or put my point across in a manner a little bit too forthright than I would normally if I was co-regulating around others in the same room. And then that has a ripple effect around the way other people respond. So the medium is moderating the way in which we actually interact.
One of the things that I would like to dig into, so we talked about trust and how it is harder to establish trust in a, let's say, a fully remote setting. One of the other things one of the other areas where it is harder to establish. One of the prerequisites for good teamwork is one of the things that we call common ground. So we use this term common ground to really refer to shared mental models and methods of communication. So it's deeper than that, but broadly it's almost what Andy Jassy was talking about when he was talking about culture. But I think it is slightly deeper than that, in as much as for a really effective team, you see that team members will build these shared mental models, this common ground, which allows them to do their job more easily because they know exactly what the scope of their responsibility is, what the responsibility of the rest of the group is. And I think one of the things that is also definitely true, having observed this in lots of organizations, it is much easier to build those shared mental models, that common ground, if you are co-located. There are very small cues about whether you're doing something right or wrong. And again, I think there is truth in the argument that Andy Jassy was making in that original memo, which was we have to really focus on culture. He says that's one of the things that he thinks about most. And the culture will be stronger when you're co-located. I mean, that's hard to argue with. It doesn't mean that it's not worth fighting for, but certainly when I've worked in that combination of fully remote or hybrid teams, you have to be so much more explicit. And we will always come back to communication here, but you have to be so much more explicit in communication, in the cultural expectations of how your organization works if you're remote. And arguably, it's even harder if you're in a hybrid organization. So we talked about it being a scale. Fully co-located is relatively easy. It's very natural for us. We have evolved to do it. Fully remote actually isn't that difficult either, because then everybody is bound by exactly the same constraints, and so the behaviors are synchronized. But where there is some difference, and you talked about that great example of where there were people on the ground and the Apollo astronauts, and there was a difference in the expectation and the reality that they were experiencing at that time that was hard to get over with the technology, with the communication. And so one of the things that I think is really important for anybody working inside a virtual team, collaborating inside a virtual team, is to really think about how you build trust and also how you build that common ground and the shared mental models.
I think a lot of it is about how intentional you are about trying to find that shared context. So I'd say like the shared context concept, common ground, is like that. It's that layers that sits above what we just talked about in terms of co-presence and co-regulation. It's a bit more kind of specific to the environment that you occupy. But if you are co-present, if you're co-located, the context is taken for granted. So when you're talking about common ground, which is a foundational linguistic concept, common ground is established through our shared understanding of our context, and there are layers to it, but a lot of it is just taken as read because we are aware that we are sharing. That's kind of first level of common ground, is we are aware that we are both aware that we're sharing the same space, and that gives us a foundation upon which to build common ground. And there's a security, again, this kind of psychological security that is fostered by knowing that. That's entirely detached virtually. And I think being aware that lack of shared context can be somewhat destabilizing for people in virtual teams just means it's another thing that if you're operating virtually, you probably just need to give some intentional direction, some intentional time dedicated towards it. Silly things like we're all going to dial in from the same coffee chain for our meeting today, and the consistency that the cookie cutter nature of some of these chains means that we're all actually in a way sharing the same environment. We're all going to wear the same color jumper when we dial in. It could be any of these things. It's a little bit gimmicky, but it's creating shared context. However, one of the difficulties with virtual teams, which co-located teams don't suffer from, is some of that context is actually about the kind of rhythms of the environment. The rhythms of that shared context also inform a sense of common ground. So it's not just about what we can see around us, but it's like, um, the circadian rhythms, the light, the noises, the who else is in the space. That also creates a cadence and a beat to which we align ourselves, and that also creates a sense of shared context. So it's it's a challenging one, I think, for virtual teams, but at least awareness of the fact that these things make an unconscious difference to the ability for co-located teams to do their work. You have to work a little bit harder if you're operating virtually to try and mitigate for the lack of those things.
There's a couple of things that I wanted to dig into there. One, the first one was just another anecdote. This time, apparently from the Mars Climate Orbiter, where so this was a story that I only recently came across. So I have to do some more digging to make sure it's actually true. But let's just treat it as an anecdote. But in the Mars Climate Orbiter, the team members were very geographically diverse. They were in Denver and Pasadena. They were trying to work on getting the spacecraft to push itself into orbit, but the members of the team were using different measurements. So they were using imperial and metric measurements, and so they actually failed to achieve that because they hadn't established something relatively simple. And when I heard that example, it reminded me of the point that you had made before about how air traffic control and in aviation, they use feet and knots and meters differently, right?
The simple one is about separation. So aviation, vertical separation versus horizontal separation. So you will always hear vertical separation in feet, and you will always hear horizontal separation in kilometers. And that means that, if you're getting a very urgent message about an oncoming aircraft and they tell you that you're on course for a collision, they are only 60 kilometers away from you, or 600 kilometers, whatever it might be, you know that they're on your vector at the same vertical separation. So you need to increase your vertical separation. So you need to climb or dive, or maybe descend. You should be a bit calmer about it. But that's the point, is the contained within the message is a clear shared understanding.
Yeah, a pre-shared understanding, a shared mental model that's been established.
Right, so I think we've covered a lot already. We knew that we were going to have a lot to say on this subject. I mean, this is so important to contemporary work, is getting the art of virtual team working right. I think we've established kind of where it's come from, the context,
Yeah.
the fact that it's still a hot topic. It's the central subject within this recent announcement from Amazon, which is really interesting. What we should do, we'll leave it there, and then let's pick back up and do a bit more of a deep dive in the next episode into, I think, communication. Surprise, surprise, I want to talk about communication, but a little bit more discussion on communication and protocols, things like this. And then we'll round out with some recommendations. You know what, if you're listening to this, you work in an organization, virtual teamwork is part of your daily life. What are the highlights that we think people need to be aware of? How can they maximize the benefits and avoid the traps that exist within virtual team working?